valtava jäävuori ajelehti Atlantilla 600 kilometriä etelään Newfoundlandin saaresta. Kuljettuaan yli 3000 kilometrin matkan Grönlannista, siitä tuli historian kuuluisin jäävuori.
Everyone knows that the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank.
Titanicin tarina on yhtä tunnettu kuin laiva itse. Se oli aikansa suurin ja ylellisin valtamerialus, jota väitettiin jopa uppoamattomaksi. Valtava jäävuori on vain yksi palanen Titanicin tarinaa.
If anyone tells you that they found the one reason Titanic sank, then they haven't read enough.
The bow section of the ship couldn't properly fit into the yard that the ship was being built in, and that's the reason they decided to go for hand rivets.
Because the second officer had been changed over before the sinking, they didn't actually have a key for the binoculars.
A number of passengers opened their portholes to see if they could see what was going on.
A tragedy on the scale of the Titanic disaster was caused by hundreds of little events, but there are about 10 that are the key events.
All of these things combined led to the inevitable fact that the Titanic would hit the iceberg and sink.
Mikään näistä virheistä ei yksin olisi saanut laivaa uppoamaan, mutta yhdessä ne aiheuttivat suuronnettomuuden. Syyskuussa 1911 Titanic oli lähes valmiina Harland & Wolff-telakalla Belfastissa. Laivan varustamo White Star Line oli tilannut 3 samanlaista laivaa, joilla se aikoi hämmästyttää maailmaa. Olympicin, Titanicin ja Britannicin.
It sounds a cliché, but she really was beautiful.
The Titanic was the largest passenger ship in the world at the time of her introduction into service.
882 feet long, which made her the longest ship afloat.
In fact, she was the largest moving object made by man at the time.
If you stood her on the end, she's nearly as tall as the Empire State Building, and yet she's only as wide as 1/3 of a football field. So she's very long, she's very sleek, she's very graceful on the outside. On the inside, she is opulent beyond belief. They wanted to create the most comfortable Atlantic crossing you could possibly imagine.
Ylellisyyksiensä lisäksi Titanic saattoi ylpeillä turvallisuudellaan. Siinä oli enemmän pelastusveneitä kuin missään muussa laivassa. Käytössä oli myös uusi keksintö, radiolaite. Lisäksi laivassa oli vesitiiviit laipiot eli väliseinät, jotka estäisivät sitä uppoamasta. Laipioiden toimivuus joutui koetukselle onnettomuudessa, joka aiheuttaisi Titanicin tarinan ensimmäisen pahan virheen. –20. syyskuuta 1911 Titanicin sisaralus Olympic kulki Solentin salmessa Englannin kanaalissa.
The Olympic is about to set off for her 5th voyage across the Atlantic, and she's sailing through the Solent parallel to a Navy warship called HMS Hawke.
And they were having a bit of a race, so there was a bit of fun going on between the two ships.
Due to the restricted channel, the Olympic tried to maneuver out of the way of the Hawke, but it was misjudged.
The Olympic effectively cuts up the Hawke, and he couldn't stop a collision. Unfortunately, HMS Hawke was designed to spike other ships.
Her hull was built as a battering ram, so this huge ram actually went straight into the side of Olympic.
It cracked plates, it popped rivets.
There were very few ships in 1912 that could have survived such a disaster.
But the fact is, Olympic's bulkheads had contained the flooding.
Kuten Titanicissa, myös Olympicissa oli laipioita, jotka jakoivat laivan vesitiiviisiin osastoihin. Vaikka sotalaiva oli puhkaissut reiän sen kylkeen, laipiot estivät vettä tulvimasta koko alukseen ja pitivät sen pinnalla.
I think the spectacular survival of the Olympic from the Hawke collision planted a dangerous idea in people's minds.
If a warship can take you on and you can just sail home again and get fixed, then it's giving people the wrong idea.
Many would have thought, well, that really does make the ship relatively unsinkable.
Käsitys uppoamattomuudesta ei koskenut vain maallikkoja.
The captain of the Olympic at the time of her collision with Hawke is Edward Smith, and he will be Titanic's captain on her maiden voyage. So to his mind, he's had a practical demonstration of how one of these Olympic-class ships can be severely damaged and yet not sink. And this helps build this public perception that Titanic is unsinkable when she sails.
Törmäys herätti White Star-varustamossa vaarallista tyytyväisyyttä ja aiheutti toisenkin Titanicille kohtalokkaan seurauksen.
Following Olympic's collision, she had to be rushed to Belfast for repairs.
Varustamo halusi Olympicin mahdollisimman nopeasti takaisin liikenteeseen.
Don't forget, she's already got bookings to ferry people across the Atlantic. So in terms of your priorities, if you're White Star Line, you're losing revenue. So you set Titanic aside and you fix Olympic before you go back to finishing Titanic.
Olympicin korjaaminen viivästytti Titanicin valmistumista ja sen neitsytmatkaa 3 viikolla.
The delay of a month into service put Titanic's entry into commission in April, right at the beginning of the ice period on the North Atlantic.
A season which is notorious for icebergs.
Kaikkein kukkuraksi tuona keväänä laivareiteillä oli tavallista enemmän jäävuoria epätavallisen sään takia.
Usually in any April you'd expect sight of about 125 of them. That year there were over 400.
It's about the worst that they've seen for 50 years.
Poikkeukselliset sääolot toivat Pohjois-Atlantin laivareiteille yli 3-kertaisen määrän jäävuoria tavanomaiseen verrattuna.
There were a number of factors that brought the ice across the shipping lanes in April 1912. One of them was a warm winter in 1911, and this had created a huge amount of freezing meltwater. There was so much ice in the Labrador Current in April 1912 that instead of the bergs melting away as soon as they hit the Gulf Stream, this actual floodwater, this freezing river, flowed very far south into the Atlantic.
Titanicin kohtaloksi koitunut jäävuori ei kulkenut suoraan, vaan kaarteli laajasti.
The iceberg doesn't drift straight into the Atlantic. It follows the currents, it travels north for a little while, and it's journeying around for about 6 months until eventually it drifts into the shipping lanes just south of Newfoundland in Canada.
10. huhtikuuta 1912 Titanicilla oli yli 2200 matkustajaa ja miehistön jäsentä, kun se lähti Southamptonista 7-päiväiselle neitsytmatkalleen kohti New Yorkia.
Titanic was planning to be at Pier 59 in New York on the 17th of April. Now, in fact, given the distance from Europe to New York, she only had to maintain an average of 18 knots.
Törmätessään jäävuoreen Titanic kulki kuitenkin paljon kovempaa.
The simple fact is she was going too fast. 22 knots in an ice field. Had she been going slower, she may have missed the berg. Everything else would have been academic.
Kova vauhti oli Titanicin toinen paha virhe. Se olisi voitu välttää helposti, mutta kapteeni Smithillä oli nopean kapteenin maine.
Captain Smith was the White Star Line's best captain. He was known as the millionaire's captain, and that's because people loved travelling with him.
Not only is he a competent captain and a captain that you would trust with your big shiny new ship, but more importantly, he has the patter.
He was urbane, he was sophisticated, he looked the part.
The millionaires and the first-class passengers, they love him. He's very good at schmoozing.
After all, being the master of one of these big ships is really being in charge of a big group of passengers, socialising with them.
People would book on to a ship to sail with Captain Smith. So nobody else was going to get the job.
He really liked going fast as well. He liked to get his passengers there as fast as possible. And let's face it, these passengers wanted to get there on time, and they knew that come hell or high water, Smith would get them there.
White Star Line pitched themselves as the reliable option. If they say that they will get you to New York on Wednesday, then you will be there on Wednesday, come what may.
Kapteeni Smith tiesi, että aikataulussa pysyminen vaati nopeutta.
What we know from Smith's logbook is he was gradually going faster and faster. As the engines of these new liners settled down, he was putting on more speed.
Smith piti yllä keskimäärin 21 solmun vauhtia, eli 2 tai 3 solmua tarvittua nopeampaa.
Invariably, most captains operating on a transatlantic voyage will want to go as fast as possible in the early part of the voyage to have something in hand in case they encounter fog. Fog is very prevalent on the North Atlantic, and it generally means you have to slow down. So by going faster at the beginning, you have something in hand just in case you meet the unexpected fog.
This was quite the norm in 1912. Skippers tended not to slow down until they had visibility problems. They always felt if they could see far enough ahead to turn or to stop. Icebergs were a navigational hazard which you had to take into account, but it was more usual for ships to arrive late than hit icebergs.
Kapteeni Smith tuskin oli kovin huolissaan jäävuorista. 7 kuukautta aiemmin hän oli selviytynyt pahasta törmäyksestä Olympicilla.
If you are Smith and you have captained Olympic and she's survived being rammed by a scary-looking spike on the front of a Royal Naval vessel, then you are not going to be that concerned about what a little iceberg might do to you. Because in your mind, if there's a big iceberg, your people are going to see it and steer away from it.
No doubt the perceived risk of striking an iceberg was so small that it was discounted. But there was the very real risk if the ship arrived late in New York, there would be a lot of adverse publicity.
Tällä Atlantin ylitysmatkalla kapteenilla oli kuitenkin myös toisenlainen huoli. Laivan uumenissa piili jotain, minkä varustamo oli salannut matkustajilta.
It is now quite well known that Titanic was in fact on fire when she left Southampton on her maiden voyage. In 1912, ships were powered by steam and the boilers were powered by coal, and Titanic used 600 tons of coal a day, which was shoveled into the boilers by a team of firemen.
The whole idea is the coal would power the ship from one side of the Atlantic to the other. Sometimes in some of the bunkers you could get combustion of a piece of coal, which would result in a bunker fire.
When you have a pile of coal stored in a bunker, oxygen or water can get in and start reacting with the coal. The ingredients for a fire are oxygen, which we've got, a heat source, which we have, again here, and fuel, which is our coal. So all the ingredients are there, and as more of this coal combusts, the heat goes up in that room, and therefore more coal will catch fire, and it's almost like a chain reaction.
Kun lämmittäjiä kuultiin uppoamisen jälkeen, he paljastivat, että kattilahuoneessa numero 5 oli riehunut tulipalo.
The fire had been going since Belfast, when Titanic would have sailed with a skeleton crew round to Southampton to make the voyage.
So when the Titanic left Southampton, the fire was already there.
10 metriä korkea hiilivarasto saatiin tyhjennettyä vasta päivää ennen törmäystä.
Fire was burning for something in the region of about 10 days. It took that long to actually empty the bunker.
10 päivää kestäneellä tulipalolla täytyi olla seurauksensa.
When you think about it, it's quite obvious that days and days of fire heat on something is going to have an effect on the bunker.
Jopa 1000 asteen kuumuus sai säiliön terässeinät hehkumaan tulipunaisina.
If you imagine a sheet of metal, which the Titanic was made of, if you imagine that is made up of individual building blocks. Imagine those building blocks are attached together with glue. That glue is going to get warmer and it's going to make that sheet of metal more bendy. So that's what happens when it heats up. They're not really designed to withstand that kind of heat, and it could have been much hotter than 500 degrees in there.
Teräslevyillä, jotka muodostivat hiilisäiliön takaseinän, oli toinenkin tärkeä tehtävä. Ne olivat osa vesitiivistä laipiota väliseinää, jonka oli tarkoitus estää vettä tulvimasta koko alukseen.
We know for a fact that the heat caused by the fire did affect the bulkhead between boiler rooms 6 and 5.
What two of the surviving firemen actually said was that once the coal was taken out of bunker number 5, that you could see how the bunker had warped because of the continued heat it had been exposed to.
Barrett described it as being dinged in on one side and out on the other side.
Teräslevyjen vääntyminen heikensi yhtä laivan elintärkeistä laipioista.
We know from the inquiry into the Titanic disaster that the intense heat of the bunker fire on the Titanic had actually deflected the metal of the hull. And this meant that there was no longer a perfect seal, and in fact the fire-damaged plates in the bulkhead may have been weeping about 1 or 2 buckets of water per hour, even before the collision.
So there was a degree of the bulkhead being compromised. To what degree, no one's really sure. But the mere fact that it was dinged at all suggests that there was something wrong.
Normaalisti vaurio ei olisi vaikuttanut laivan turvallisuuteen mitenkään.
It's an inconvenience of the job. It's something they would have dealt with before successfully. They wouldn't have been obsessing about the integrity of the ship because of the bunker fire.
Vain jokin todella epätavallinen tapaus voisi tehdä tulipalosta merkittävän. Pohjois-Atlantin hyytävillä vesillä ajelehti suuria jäävuoria etelämmässä kulkeville laivareiteille.
Bergs come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Some of them were just things called growlers, which is really just huge lumps of ice floating near the surface. The berg the Titanic actually crashed into was larger than this 5-story engine behind me.
Titanicin ensimmäisenä matkapäivinä sen 1300 matkustajaa nauttivat White Star Line varustamon tarjoamasta ylellisyydestä. Laivan lähestyessä New Yorkia vauhdikkaalla 22 solmun nopeudella valtava jäävuori ajelehti hitaasti kohti etelää. Sellaista jättiläistä yksikään merikapteeni ei olisi halunnut kohdata.
She has more than 1 million tons of ice, and most of it is below the surface. And there's a huge jagged edge of it just waiting to snag you as you go past.
Vuonna 1912 useimmilla Atlantin ylittävillä linjalaivoilla oli käytössään Guglielmo Marconin keksimä langaton lennätin eli radiolaite. Sillä laivat varoittivat toisiaan vaarallisista jäävuorista.
Early 20th century, Marconian wireless was actually quite new. Basically, the telegraphists were trained in what they call Morse code, dit, dit, da, da. The whole idea was that they would signal using a key to a ship which could be, in the case of the Titanic, several hundred miles away, depending on how big and how high your antenna was.
Sunnuntai-iltana 14. huhtikuuta Titanicin sähköttäjät tekivät kuitenkin pahan virheen. He eivät kiinnittäneet huomiota varoituksiin jäästä muiden viestien noustessa etusijalle.
In 1912, radio was a novelty. The radio operators were employed by the Marconi Company and not the White Star Line. And what they were interested in doing is getting paid to send messages from passengers to the shore.
It's the equivalent of having Wi-Fi now. It was something for passengers to communicate
About stocks and shares or what time people would meet other people.
Hello, boy. Dining with you tonight in spirit. Heart with you always. Best love, girl.
No sickness? All well. Not if I are interested in poker. Sending you this from the middle of the Atlantic.
The wireless operators, they are there as a commercial entity to send passenger traffic. So there's a conflict of interest between what they prioritise and how urgently certain messages are dealt with.
Matkustajia koskevien viestien lisäksi sähköttäjät vastaanottivat lähellä kulkevilta laivoilta kiireellisiä varoituksia, joiden tärkeyttä painotettiin 3 kirjaimella.
MSG, Master Servicegram, was a priority message that was intended to be sent to the captain, and it was used for things such as ice warnings and the like.
If they have the MSG prefix, you make sure that the captain gets it.
Aiemmin samana päivänä tulleet useat varoitukset jäävuorista oli merkitty MSG:llä, jolloin ne oli välitetty kapteeni Smithille.
Captain Smith saw and received all these messages, so he decided to go a little bit further on about half an hour additional travel before turning west towards New York. Heading a little bit further south, just to sort of give himself a little bit more leeway to what he thought lay ahead.
Kello 17.50 laiva muutti kurssiaan. Pian sen jälkeen kapteeni Smith lähti komentosillalta päivälliselle. Hän ei tiennyt, mitä kurssin vaihto merkitsisi. Sillä välin kun Smith viihdytti ensimmäisen luokan matkustajia ylellisellä 10 ruokalajin päivällisellä, radiohytissä viestit ruuhkautuivat.
Saturday night, Sunday morning on the Titanic had been very, very difficult for the 2 telegraphists. They had a major failure of the equipment. In fact, they spent about 6 or 7 hours trying to repair it. As a result, during this time, a very, very large backlog of communications had built up.
Kello 21.52 saapui jälleen varoitus jäästä. Tällä kertaa höyrylaivalta nimeltä Mesaba. Myös Mesaba oli matkalla New Yorkiin, kulkien lähes samassa kurssissa muutaman tunnin Titanicia edellä.
So much heavy pack ice and a great number large icebergs. Also field ice.
Radiosanoma oli selvä varoitus siitä, että Titanicin uusi kurssi veisi sen alueelle, jossa oli paljon suuria jäävuoria. Kapteeni Smith ei kuitenkaan saanut viestiä.
The problem with the Mesaba message is that there was no MSG prefix. Now, Jack Phillips was not a navigator, so when the Mesaba message came in, all he saw was numbers there. It would have meant nothing to him.
Had the letters MSG been on that message when it was received by Jack Phillips, then that message he would have known to prioritise it and send it to the bridge. As it was, it didn't have them, so he set the message aside for later and carried on with his passenger traffic.
Noin tuntia myöhemmin Titanic sai vielä vakavamman varoituksen, nyt laivalta, joka oli vain 20 kilometrin päässä. Siitäkin viestistä puuttuivat kuitenkin tärkeät 3 kirjainta, MSG.
At 10:30 p.m. on the night the Titanic sank, so only an hour before the collision, a vital message came in from the nearby Californian, who radioed the Titanic to say that they were stopped and surrounded by ice. Now, unfortunately, right at the moment that it arrived, the wireless operators on the Titanic were really busy doing what's called working Cape Race.
Titanic was trying to communicate with Newfoundland over 400 miles away, so it would have had its radio set switched on to a very high level. The Californian, fairly close to the Titanic, when it sent out the message to the ship, it would have come through extremely loud.
It nearly blasted their ears off. So the Titanic replied, "Keep out, old man," which meant, "Please be quiet, we're busy." And sadly, with that, the operator on the Californian went to bed.
Ennen kuin Californian toisti viestinsä tai antoi MSG-koodin, Titanic katkaisi yhteyden siihen.
So the last chance to warn the Titanic of ice in the area was lost.
Californianin radiosähköttäjä oli aikonut kertoa, että riski törmätä jäävuoreen oli erittäin suuri ja hänen laivansa oli pysähtynyt pimeän ajaksi. Jos kapteeni Smith olisi saanut viestin, hän olisi saattanut toimia samoin.
This is one of the great what ifs of the Titanic. And you could say it was a mistake, most definitely. When the radio operator on the Californian was told to shut up, he basically shut up. He was going to bed that night anyway. He just closed down, went to bed. 10 minutes later, Titanic hit the iceberg.
Radio ei ollut ainoa keino jäävuorten välttämiseksi. 15 metriä Titanicin etukannen yläpuolella sen keulamastossa oli märssykori. Yötä päivää korissa oli tähystäjä, jonka tehtävänä oli varoittaa edessä olevista vaaroista.
Captain Smith and Titanic officers knew jolly well they were going into an ice area and they would have to keep a very sharp lookout indeed. And the White Star Line was one of the only shipping companies that employed dedicated lookouts.
Tuona yönä Titanicin tähystäjinä toimivat Reginald Lee ja Frederick Fleet. Heillä oli vuosien kokemus jäävuorten tähystämisestä. 14. huhtikuuta heiltä kuitenkin puuttui tärkeä työväline.
The best way of spotting an iceberg was basically using your natural eyesight as wide as possible on the horizon. When you saw something ahead, then you would identify it with the binoculars.
Märssykorin kiikaria säilytettiin toisen perämiehen hytissä. Tähystäjät eivät kuitenkaan olleet saaneet sitä käsinsä.
Nobody really knows what happened. The only thing we know for a fact is that before the Titanic left Southampton, there was a reordering of the officers. Henry Wilde came over from the Olympic with Captain Smith, and as a result, Second Officer David Blair left the Titanic.
Lähtiessään Titanicilta, Blair luultavasti vei hyttinsä avaimen mukanaan.
Because the second officer had been changed over before the sinking, they didn't actually have a key for the binoculars.
Normaaleissa olosuhteissa kiikaritta jääminen ei olisi ollut ongelma. Tuona iltana sääolot olivat kuitenkin poikkeukselliset.
The conditions the night the Titanic sank were truly extraordinary. It was one of the clearest nights in history. The pressure was very high, which meant that the air was crystal clear. In fact, the starlight was so bright the night the Titanic sank that one crew member said you could have played a game of football. This gave them confidence that they could go fast and still see the iceberg.
You think you're looking at a clear sea, but what you're actually looking at is a haze. There's kind of like an optical illusion happening, and it's masking things like icebergs from sight, so it really is a bit of a mind twist.
If you look at this glass of water here, as the pencil is behind it, what you can start to see is the different shapes that are being made. And that's simply because light is bending according to the density of the water behind it. And this was the same the night the Titanic sank, because the air was different densities, and therefore the light was bending. Everyone has heard of a desert mirage. Well, this actually created what we call a miraging haze at the horizon behind the iceberg. So in effect, the haze on the distant horizon actually camouflaged the iceberg in the near ground.
Tähystäjillä Frederick Fleetillä ja Reginald Leellä ei ollut aavistustakaan, että he katselivat optista harhaa.
If they'd had binoculars, theoretically, they could have seen that base of the berg a little bit earlier, and those few seconds could have been crucial for Titanic.
Onnettomuustutkinnassa Fleetiltä kysyttiin puuttuvasta kiikarista. Vastaus oli paljon puhuva.
I'd have seen the iceberg a bit sooner.
How much sooner?
Well enough to get out of the way.
Kello 23.30 Titanic saapui jäävuorivyöhykkeelle rivakalla 22 solmun nopeudella turvanaan vain tähystäjien silmät. Se kulki yli 10 metriä sekunnissa ja oman pituutensa verran alle puolessa minuutissa. Liian nopeasti ehtiäkseen reagoida mihinkään, mikä ilmestyisi udusta. Kello 23:39 komentosillalla piti vahtia perämies Andrew Murdoch. Kapteeni oli mennyt nukkumaan. 37 sekuntia ennen törmäystä Frederick Fleet huomasi vaaran ja huusi, jäävuori suoraan edessä. Murdoch kuuli 3 kellon kilahdusta, mikä oli merkki vaarasta keulan suunnassa.
As soon as the 3 strikes of the bell were heard, Murdoch looked ahead to assess the situation. He could see a berg coming directly towards them, and he decided to turn.
He immediately had the helm put over first to the left and then to the right to try and skirt round the iceberg, and then that the engine should be stopped.
He shouted the order, and then it was confirmed that the wheel was swung hard over. At the same time, he rang full astern on Titanic's engine telegraph.
Valtava alus alkoi kääntyä, mutta se ei ehtinyt väistää vedenpinnan alaista jääkielekettä.
Whilst they've almost cleared the iceberg above the water, what they haven't done is clear the massive portion of it under the waterline, and what happens is the iceberg rakes the side of the Titanic under the waterline.
Laivanrakennusinsinööri Stephen Payne suunnitteli Queen Mary 2 aluksen. Hän uskoo, että Titanicin ohjaus ei toiminut tehokkaasti niinä ratkaisevina sekunteina.
In simple terms, a rudder deflects water. Simple flat plate. And you twist it at the stern and it directs the water flow from one side to the other. But the efficiency of the Titanic's rudder was augmented by the central propeller, thrusting water past this flat plate.
Titanicin keskipotkuri antoi peräsimelle lisävoimaa suunnanmuutoksiin, mutta vain pyöriessään.
Crucially, when the order was given to stop the engines and then latterly reverse them, the center propeller would have been stopped.
Kun keskipotkuri pysähtyi ratkaisevalla hetkellä, se ei enää työntänyt vettä kohti peräsintä.
We're talking about a marginal situation here. And perhaps the rudder working a few percentage points more efficiently may have swung round just a little bit more to actually miss the iceberg.
Väistö epäonnistui ja Titanic osui jäävuoreen. Osuma oli kuitenkin niin vino, että harva ymmärsi, mitä oli tapahtunut. Matkustajat olivat täysin tietämättömiä siitä, että syvällä pinnan alla laivan kohtalo oli jo sinetöity.
People were not prepared for what was going to happen. They certainly didn't realize that the ship was about to sink.
Osuessaan laivan styrpuurin puoleiseen kylkeen jäävuori luultavasti ei repinyt teräsronkoa auki, toisin kuin usein väitetään. Sen sijaan se paljasti 7. ratkaisevan virheen, joka koitui Titanicin tuhoksi. Titanicin runko oli tehty sadoista metallilevyistä. Ne oli liitetty yhteen 3 miljoonalla niitillä, joista useimmat olivat terästä.
A rivet is a way of fastening 2 sheets of metal together. You would take this rivet and heat it up and then put it in through a hole that was punched through the 2 pieces of metal that are lined up on top of each other. And the rivet is put in through that hole and then hammered at the flat end, and that deforms the flat end into another head and fastens these two pieces of metal together.
Yleensä niitit pitävät hyvin, mutta tuona yönä meri oli poikkeuksellisen kylmä.
Because Titanic was cutting through smooth, icy waters, her hull would have actually been below freezing at the time of the collision.
Yksinkertainen koe osoittaa, miten lämpötila vaikuttaa teräksen kestävyyteen. Titanicin niitit tehtiin tällaisista terästangoista. Huoneen lämpöinen terästanko vääntyy, mutta ei katkea. Kun se jäähdytetään alle 0-asteisessa vedessä, tapahtuu merkittävä muutos. Jääkylmä teräs menettää kykynsä sitoa itseensä iskun energiaa. Kylmässä meressä myös Titanicin niitit muuttuivat hauraiksi. Korkealaatuisia teräsniittejä voi lyödä vain isolla hydraulisella niittauskoneella, mikä oli vaikeaa Titanicin keulaosassa.
The hydraulic riveter was a very, very large, unwieldy piece of equipment. Where the hydraulic riveter was not so efficient was in the parts which are not straight, the turn of the bilge, or in the bow of the ship, where the hull is more angled. As a result, you had to use manual riveting crews there.
Teräsniittejä ei kuitenkaan voitu lyödä käsivoimin, niinpä aluksen keulassa levyt oli kiinnitettävä rautaniitein. Rautaniiteillä oli vakavia haittapuolia.
Wrought iron is not quite as versatile as steel, and when it's made in the smelting process, it produces a byproduct called slag, which is just all the stuff in the ore that you don't really want in your iron.
Kuonaa sisältävät rautaniitit saattavat murtua, jos ne kylmänä saavat kovan iskun. Laivan törmäys jäävuoreen on juuri sellainen isku.
You really have to appreciate the forces that were involved here. When you consider Titanic, 50,000 tons of weight, moving at 20 miles per hour, there's a lot of energy in that system. And to strike an iceberg, which to all intents and purposes is an immovable object, you've suddenly got all that energy striking a solid object.
As the iceberg hits the Titanic, that force and that impact has to be absorbed, it has to go somewhere, and it's going to impact the weakest sections of the ship that it's hitting, and those are along the seams, along the rivets. So the ship basically gets unzipped and water floods in, and we know what happens after that.
Hauraat niitit katkesivat, jolloin rungon teräslevyt rakoilivat monesta kohdasta vesirajan alapuolella. Rautaniittien käyttö oli paha virhe, mutta Titanicin väitettiin selviävän suuristakin vaurioista.
Titanic had 15 bulkheads, dividing her into 16 compartments. If part of the hull was breached in any way, that the flooding would be contained.
Titanic oli suunniteltu niin, että se kesti vuodon jopa 4 pääosastoon. Lisäksi etummaisessa osastossa oli ylimääräinen vesitiivis tila hidastamassa veden pääsyä keulaan.
This made her effectively one of the safest ships afloat.
10 minuuttia törmäyksestä kaikki vaikutti rauhalliselta. Ruumakannen kattilahuoneissa kehittyi kuitenkin hallitsematon tapahtumaketju, joka paljastaisi kohtalokkaan heikkouden Titanicin suunnittelussa, jonka piti tehdä se uppoamattomaksi.
Our man on the spot that night, in terms of the boiler room, is Fred Barrett, a fireman on the Titanic.
Barrettin kattilahuone alkoi täyttyä vedellä. Hän perääntyi seuraavaan osastoon.
As the watertight door closes behind him, Fred is safe in boiler room number 5.
Siellä hän huomasi, että vettä suihkusi tyhjään hiilisäiliöön ja paiskasi säiliön luukun kiinni. Se ei ollut vesitiivis, mutta hidasti veden tuloa. Seuraavan tunnin ajan hän ahkeroi vuodon kimpussa.
He's trying to oversee some kind of rescue attempt to pump water out and see if they can at least prolong the life of the ship.
Suddenly, a mass of green foamy water came crashing through into the boiler room, and Fred suddenly realised there was absolutely no more he could do. He ran to the nearest emergency ladder and got out.
Titanicin 15 laipiota jakoivat sen 16 vesitiiviiseen osastoon. Vettä tulvi kuitenkin useampaan osastoon kuin mitä sen oli suunniteltu kestävän.
At 12:40, water starts pouring into the ship, and the ship begins to sink more rapidly than before.
Barrettin jättämässä osastossa sijaitsi hiilisäiliö, jossa riehuvaa tulipaloa oli sammutettu päivien ajan. Kuumuus oli saanut teräslevyt vääntymään säiliön takaseinässä, joka muodosti osan vesitiivistä laipiota. Vettä vuosi rungon kyljen reiästä, mutta tuliko sitä myös naapuriosastosta, vaurioituneen laipion läpi.
I think you have to concede that there may have been some damage done to the bulkhead by the bulkhead fire.
We know that one of the bulkheads was exposed to the fire that was in the coal bunker, and it is possible that that heat compromised steel and it could have cracked and allowed that water to flow through.
We know from the inquiry into the Titanic disaster that the fire-damaged plates in the bulkhead may have been weeping about 1 or 2 buckets of water per hour even before the collision.
On kiisteltyä, kuinka paljon tulen vaurioittama laipio lisäsi vuotoa. Selvää on, että kun hiilisäiliö täyttyi vedellä, vuodon leviämistä esti vain huteraluukku.
The compartment filled up with 10 feet of water, and the weight of the water in that compartment was about 440 tons, and there was 3 tons of weight on the door.
When the pressure on the door got to more than 3 tons, the door burst open, sending a huge wave, knocking him to the ground.
A whole load of water, which had been held back for a while, suddenly began to overwhelm the compartment.
Titanicin etummaiset 6 osastoa olivat täyttymässä vedestä, mikä painoi sitä yhä syvemmälle pinnan alle. Siihen asti vettä oli vuotanut laivaan hitaasti ja kaikki 2200 matkustajaa olisi ehditty evakuoida. Titanicin vajotessa syvemmälle monet matkustajista tekivät pahan virheen, joka nopeuttaisi laivan tuhoa. Törmäyksen voimasta huolimatta rungon 6 repeämää olivat yllättävän pieniä.
Now, in fact, when you put all these together, it makes an area just the size of, I don't know, a fireplace or something like that. So not a very big area at all. But what happened was, after the collision, the Titanic came to a stop, and people wondered what had happened. So their natural reaction was to open the portholes and have a look.
Kun laivan kohtalo varmistui, matkustajat käskettiin yläkannelle evakuoitavaksi.
And then, when they went up to the lifeboats, they left the portholes open. As Titanic's passenger accommodation began to dip under the Atlantic, the open portholes meant that water flooded in at a much greater rate. In fact, 12 open portholes would have doubled the iceberg damage to Titanic. And of course, there were hundreds of portholes in Titanic's bow.
Matkustajien hyteissä oli yhteensä yli 300 ikkunaa. Titanicin uppoamista vauhditti inhimillinen uteliaisuus. Aluksen täyttyessä kävi selväksi, että vesitiiviiden laipioiden suunnittelussa oli tehty kohtalokas virhe. Keskimäärin 12 metriä korkeat laipiot eivät yltäneet matkustajakansille asti. Se oli ollut suunnittelijoiden harkittu valinta.
The designers of the ship wanted more space for the deck and more rooms for the passengers. So the bulkheads didn't go all the way up to the top of the ship.
The problem is that you have a hotel. The whole reason the ship is there is for the easy movement of passengers in their cabins, through the public spaces.
Suunnittelijat joutuivat katumaan päätöstä laipioiden korkeudesta. Kun vesi nousi laipioiden yli, niistä ei ollut enää mitään hyötyä. Vesi syöksyi kaikkiin osastoihin ja avoimiin tiloihin esteettä. Se oli viimeinen, ratkaiseva isku. Titanicin keula vajosi pinnan alle ja perä nousi korkealle ilmaan.
In the final moments, there were thunderous crashes as the steel was heard down below to be breaking apart at the keel level. And then higher up, there was almost a stampede of passengers towards the stern of the ship.
She rises so high in the water and then she seems to right herself again and people think they're safe. Everything might be all right briefly, but all that is the stern snapping off and falling back down. You have all-out chaos in the final death throes.
The lights went out, and then the ship bobbed for a bit, and then disappeared forever.
Kello 2.20 maanantaina 15. huhtikuuta Titanic upposi Atlantin kylmiin syvyyksiin, vieden mukanaan 1500 matkustajaa ja miehistön jäsentä. Törmättyään jäävuoreen alus oli pysytellyt pinnalla 2 tuntia ja 40 minuuttia.
I think it was remarkable just how well the ship did, considering 1/3 of the ship had been fatally compromised.
Niin monilta kuolonuhreilta olisi ehkä vältytty ilman yhtä ratkaisevaa erehdystä, Titanicin viimeistä virhettä. Ellei ensimmäinen perämies Murdoch olisi yrittänyt väistää jäävuorta, Titanic olisi saattanut selviytyä törmäyksestä.
If the Titanic had struck the iceberg head-on, about 100 feet, 1/8 of the length of the ship would have been crushed, but the watertight bulkheads would have held. The likelihood is that that damage would not have been fatal and the ship would have remained afloat.
Keulaosaston suunnittelussa oli varauduttu törmäykseen. Nykyautojen törmäysvyöhykkeen tavoin sen oli tarkoitus sitoa itseensä eninosa iskun energiasta, suojata taaempia osastoja ja vähentää veden vuotamista alukseen. Mutta kun Murdoch yritti kääntää Titanicia väistöliikkeeseen, jäävuori osui laivan kylkeen.
Titanic heeled over and left the coffin-shaped flat bottom, presented it to the shelf of the berg. So a lot more underwater damage was because she was what's called on the swing.
Aluksen kyljen alaosan osuminen jäävuoreen aiheutti todennäköisesti enemmän vauriota kuin mahdollinen keulatörmäys, mutta Murdoch ei olisi voinut valita toisin.
If you are First Officer Murdoch, the last thing that's going to occur to you to do is to smash face first into an iceberg. It just doesn't happen. It's against every human instinct. Also as well, it's a brand new shiny ship and it's a career ender if you make the wrong call.
In my opinion, you couldn't fault Murdoch in what he did. It was the classic response and what was expected of him.
Yli 100 vuotta myöhemmin Titanicin tuhosta on otettu opiksi paljon.
We owe them a tremendous debt and gratitude because Sailing today on a modern ship is so much safer because of the lessons learned from the Titanic.
As a result of the Titanic, we have lifeboats for everybody, we have greater watertight integrity in ships, we have greater safety regulations, although health and safety can drive you nuts.
As the designer of the Queen Mary 2, the last transatlantic liner operating on the Atlantic, I had to be acutely aware of all the lessons learnt from the Titanic. And in fact, the majority of those lessons are now enshrined in maritime law.
They have a saying that safety rules are written in blood. Well, in the Titanic's case, that couldn't be more true.